A little lesson, a little lesson there on the beautiful ones are not the easiest ones to sing along to, hey, the videos, the production value. So, 10 years ago now, in 2015, my partner Jamie and I made one of the most consequential decisions of our relationship when we moved to Dajingid's Haida Gwaii, what used to be called Queen Charlotte City of the Queen Charlotte Islands. It's a town of about 800 people on a remote archipelago in northern BC. It's about 750 kilometers north of here as the crow flies. And we had decided to move there to the traditional territories of the Haida people because it's the place where reconciliation and self-government are the most advanced. And we wanted to deepen our own understanding of decolonization, and we wanted to deepen our practices of solidarity. So we fell in love with the place and the people there so much, and with each other so much more just by being there, that after we'd been there for about 6 months, we decided to get married there. And a few days before our wedding, a friend took us out on his boat to try to catch some fish that we could feed to our wedding guests. And Haida Gwaii might be one of the few places in the world where you can just casually go fishing one evening and be likely to catch enough food for 60 people. I wanted to show you a photo that I'll give Amanda a moment to bring up here, because I always feel like I'm doing a disservice to my husband, Jamie, if I don't show you that his fish story is actually true. So he caught a 40-pound halibut, making my rather large spring salmon look pretty pitiful in comparison. So as a vegetarian turned temporary pescatarian, this was my first time catching a fish. And I guess you could say I had beginner's luck. So as we made our way back to the dock, we crossed several people who were pulling up their crab traps. And because they knew that we were having a wedding feast, people offered us some of their crabs. So we arrived at the dock at around 11 o'clock at night, lights still in the sky in northern BC in June, with 60 pounds of fish and about a dozen large Dungeness crabs. So after a day on the water, we were like just totally exhausted. You know that feeling when you've been in sun and wind all day doing something that's physically taxing. And our friend just made this incredibly quick work of filleting the fish. But when Jamie and I got back to our apartment, we realized we had this incredible boon, but also sort of a problem, because we had a dozen live crabs that needed to be processed. So I felt my heart sink, knowing we're going to be up all night dealing with this, the night before some of our closest friends started to arrive for the wedding. But then I realized they were all coming on a very early flight. And what better way to introduce them to Haida Gwaii than with a crab shucking party? So we put the crabs back in the cooler with some ice and some moist cloths, and we went to bed. When our friends arrived, we sat around the next morning all together in another friend's large kitchen, boiling and shucking the crabs and making crab cakes. As I looked around the table, I experienced the magic of a deep sense of belonging, of being part of a community that delights in helping each other. By turning the burdensome task of shucking the crabs into a communal experience, we brought those qualities of connection and togetherness to it, so it was no longer a burden. It was a chance to make memories and to deepen bonds. I'm just gonna grab my tea. So as you may know, across North America, what is sometimes called social capital, so those are the connections that we experience in communities, in civil society organizations like churches, it's been dramatically declining for generations now. All the other crises that we're experiencing right now as part of the poly crisis are playing out against the backdrop of loneliness and isolation that are also themselves a crisis. So in 1985, the most likely response to a question about the number of confidants a person had was 3. By 2004, the most likely response was 0. As former UUA President Peter Morales notes, we have unwittingly created a culture that rips apart human ties outside of the household. So I've always understood that what we are doing in Unitarian Universalist community is recreating again and again the ties that bind us as a human family. So when we weather the storms that our hyper-individualistic culture throws at us again and again, we express our deep commitment to creating spaces of belonging. Your mission statement that you just saw on the screen describes your commitment to a safe, supportive, stimulating environment to those who feel the need for spiritual growth. It mirrors our third principle as Unitarian Universalists: acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth. The two halves of that principle are in some tension with each other, that we both accept each other as we are and encourage each other to grow. That's that tricky dance of being in a spiritual community together, creating belonging based on the desire for growth and change, not belonging based on shared ideology. So Peter gave this wonderful talk 2 weeks ago, I wish he was here today, about the shifting focus towards greater spirituality in Unitarian Universalism. He observed that not all congregations have had a focus on spirituality. It's not something the UUA has clearly defined. And as Reverend Fiona Heath said in her homily about theological aliveness, part of our aliveness as UUs is our invitation for people to choose the words that define UUism for them, to have diverse ideas about what Unitarian Universalism is. Our fourth principle is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And one reason why our offering is so unique and so necessary in this time is that we provide a spiritual home for those who don't believe in the creeds and the dogmas that are central to other faiths. So we allow beliefs to evolve as we grow as people. It's about a search, not an endpoint. And for me personally, that search is spiritual because it's about continuously developing and continuously cultivating my sense of a connection to the sacred. A basic definition of spirituality is that it's the quality of being concerned with spirit or soul as opposed to material things. So, and I think of material not in the kind of Cartesian sense of matter versus spirit, but instead in the sense of consumerist materialism. The thirst for more and more and more stuff. The drive to turn what is sacred nature into commodities for consumers. In my last homily here, I define the sacred as what has ultimate value because it has no price. So for those of you who were here, you might remember I was talking about my experience of doing spiritual health care in the hospital and recognizing that, as research suggests, those who have a connection to the sacred are able to thrive more in the face of illness or loss. What I experienced up on Haida Gwaii was the kind of belonging that helps those other lusts to fall away. The kind that makes us less concerned with having the right kind of stuff. The kind that quiets the chatter of the ego that demands we strive for more. It's the kind of belonging that puts us back in touch with our spirit, that knows we are worthy and lovable because of how we love and respect others, not because of having the right stuff or even the right credentials on our CV. So when people feel a sense of spiritual uplift in service, I think this remembrance, this kind of homecoming, is often what they're describing. Because without first having that sense of belonging to yourself, of knowing who you truly are and what you truly value, independent of what society dictates, without that first sense of belonging, it's difficult to feel a true and lasting sense of belonging anywhere else. So Reverend Laura Lingood at First Victoria talks about how every religion has a diagnosis and a prescription. And for traditional Christianity, that diagnosis is sin, and the prescription is salvation through Christ. So she says, for Unitarian Universalism, the diagnosis is disconnection. Living in a culture and a society that disconnects us from our spirit, from each other, and from the natural world. What we offer then is reconnection. Reconnection to the still small voice within of spirit, to community, and to the interdependent web of existence, our seventh principle. That spiritual growth that we're supposed to encourage each other towards is a deepened sense of connection, and it can be transformative. It can make the chatter and the anxieties and the demands of the small ego simply fall away. So in the 21st century, in the face of the polycrisis, we seek to create belonging here. Belonging to self, belonging to community, belonging to the interdependent web. And this is an experience that goes beyond hospitality or politeness or friendliness or the other words that we sometimes associate with liberal religion. If we can create that belonging for people, then they will want to come back, like the new members who joined us today. They will want to serve. Now, when most people tell stories about belonging, they tell a story about either fitting in or not fitting in. So things like experiencing racism or being the odd one out. And many Unitarian Universalists, of course, experienced not belonging in another religious community before they found this one. And then we found a spiritual home here. But if we think about it, we also often find out that belonging isn't really an either-or proposition. It's not simply I belong or I don't belong. It's sometimes I experience belonging, and sometimes I still feel kind of left out. Sometimes I wonder if I'm changing in ways that make me unsure if I'm going to belong anymore. Or the community is changing in ways that make me unsure if I belong anymore. Sometimes we're just having a bad day, and we don't feel connected to much of anything. And spiritual practice is about cultivating depth and steadiness and consistency in our ability to connect. So the other sense of belonging that I experienced on Haida Gwaii was a deep belonging to that largest circle that Reverend Fiona talked about, the interdependent web of existence, of which we are all a part, our seventh Unitarian Universalist principle. I have to say, when I first saw the principles, I think if that one had been missing, I don't know if I would have been Unitarian Universalist. And there's a great story that I could tell another time about how that principle was added in the big process, because it was a last-minute addition. So when I first visited Haida Gwaii, it was just for a few days. And I felt such a strong sense of connection to the land there, especially to the cedar trees, that I yearned to come back. I told Jamie in tears that I was really dreaming of that. And it was so impractical that I thought he would just say, well, that's nice, dear. But instead he said, okay, well, what would it take to make that happen? Even though we were only able to stay up there for 8 months before we had to go back to Vancouver to work on the federal election, being, as I am, a suburban girl from Richmond, living in a place like Haida Gwaii permanently shifted my ability to feel myself as part of the interdependent web, to experience belonging to the natural world. So it awakened that reverential naturalism that now makes me regularly stop to deeply savor the sacred, whether it's the moon, the cedar trees outside my home in James Bay, or the tides at Driftwood Beach, just a few minutes walk from my home. The last time I went back to visit Haida Gwaii for a couple weeks, it was just before the pandemic. While I was there, I ran into a Haida friend of mine named James, a tour guide who started the first Haida-led tour company of the islands. He saw me and he said, "Welcome home," to me. And I just thought, if this Haida person can say that to me, someone who is so obviously a settler and has nothing like the tie to the land that he and his family have, we can all belong to the places that we feel called to. We can all cultivate that generosity of spirit, of welcoming someone who is an outsider into the place that we call home.